Podcast Digest. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest, folks. This is episode 20, and I want to thank you again for taking a few minutes out of your week to listen to this show. If anyone can attest, I know there are a ton of great podcasts out there, and I really appreciate you guys making me a part of your subscription list. If you're new to this show, I strongly encourage you guys go back, listen to all the previous episodes. They can be found at thepodcastdigest.info, and don't forget to follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. That's where you can catch all the new show announcements. So far, I've recommended 33 great podcasts, and I'll be adding another one to that list in just a few minutes. Last week's episode was my first featuring another podcast host, and so far, the feedback has been awesome. I hope you have enjoyed it. I plan on doing more of that. In fact, I've got more of that for you right now. I'm really enjoying talking to other hosts about some of the shows that I really love listening to, and I hope you're digging it as well. Before we get into this week's show, I just want to ask each of you to please share this with your friends. Seriously, share it on Facebook, retweet it on Twitter. You can even screenshot your podcast app and share it on Instagram. I've done it. You should probably give it a try. It's the best way for the show to grow. And of course, ratings and reviews on iTunes and Stitcher are greatly appreciated. But we'll be talking about that some more in just a bit. And now for this week's show, it's my honor to be joined by another podcast host. Back on episode 12, I told you about a phenomenal movie review podcast called No Totally. Today, I get to chat with one of their hosts, Shaun from No Totally. Welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's great to be here. I'm very honored.
Well, I'm glad you're here as well. I'm glad that we can go back and talk about the show that I let everybody know back on November 16th. So if you haven't heard that episode yet, I strongly encourage you to go back and listen to that one as sort of a precursor to our conversation here today. But Shaun, tell us, for those of us who have been listening to No Totally for a little while now, I know you've got plenty of fans out there. I want to know a little bit about sort of the history of the show. How did this all come to be?
Sure. There are many different versions of this story. I'll give you maybe like the not the shortest one and not the longest one, but I'll give you like a short, medium one. I was born and raised in Hawaii, and I moved to San Diego about 11 or 12 years ago, something like that. Pretty soon after I moved, I met Brian at a job that I had at this graphic design place. Coincidentally, that's also where I met my wife, which is cool. Brian was from New Hampshire, and long story short, he ended up moving back to New Hampshire. We were still really close friends, and as often happens when you have a close friend that moves away, we didn't talk as much as we would have liked to, I guess. Every time we have conversations, or every time we had conversations about movies and comic books and whatever, it was always really fun. We'd always end up on the phone for 3 hours without knowing it. Both of our wives would be yelling at us to get off the phone. And Brian had this idea, which actually he claims that he had the idea for the podcast, which, that's kind of ridiculous because everybody has podcasts. Like, you can't say that anymore. But the other thing is that it was originally my wife who said, "You guys are hilarious. You should put on a podcast," which, of course, I ignored because my wife is so great that she thinks that everything I say is hilarious when in fact 90% of it is not. But, the idea really stuck with Brian. So he proposed at one point to start doing a movie-based podcast. And so we've been doing it for about a year and a half now.
That's awesome. That is a cool story. And I think that the folks I talked to last week at Cool Story Show sort of had a similar conversation where they were all sort of talking together and then decided, hey, we should put this out for the world to hear. So it's I guess that's how podcasts that are other than those by themselves, like me, sort of come together.
I've heard that story like 20 times maybe. Honestly, just the whole idea of, well, we always have great conversations and we figured we should just start recording them. Like, literally, I think that's how every single podcast in the history of podcasting has started.
I think so. I think there's probably no reason for me to ask that question anymore.
Just play back my response. They can steal the whole San Diego New Hampshire thing. That's fine. Anybody can have that.
I think it would just fit. And for the record, Shaun, as far as meeting your wife at work, I did the same thing with
great.
My day job as well. So I'm in the same boat for you. So let me ask you this. So you guys said you had conversations about movies, comic books, things of that nature. How did you guys decide to settle on movies? Was that just sort of the greatest passion, so to speak?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons is that we disagree a lot on movies. There are some conversations you have with friends that to you sound interesting, but in reality, it's more like, Did you see that episode of Breaking Bad? Oh my God, man, it was so great. Oh, and when he did the thing, yeah, that was awesome. Oh, and he did that other thing. Oh, that was so awesome. And I would not want to listen to that. I don't. I mean, it's fun to be involved in those conversations, but I don't think it would make that great of a podcast. So, one of the reasons that we went with movies is that we disagree so much, and so it becomes a little more entertaining. I think you can probably hear that in some of our episodes. Can't think of one off the top of my head that we've really disagreed on. But Brian and I, because we've known each other for so long, we're comfortable basically saying anything to each other. So we can be very mean to each other, which I think is funny, hopefully, I guess. But the other thing about it is that we approach movies a little bit differently. You know, he's very plot oriented, he's very much about kind of feeling out a movie, and I'm a lot more interested in kind of technical aspects. I like to think about things like direction. I like to think about things like camera movements. You know, I also like to experience movies. I just kind of focus on those things a little bit more. So I think it was something as far as a subject that we could talk about that could potentially be interesting to other people rather than, you know, the other subjects.
I think it is interesting as a listener now for several months. I find it extraordinarily interesting. I do come from a fair interest in movies. I mean, if you look at the podcasts that I've recommended up to this point, I mean, between the Do Over, How Is This Movie, That'll Play, we'll touch on movies. You guys, you know, there's all kinds of Moving the Needle, all kinds of shows that I definitely appreciate that. You know, I think back, I had a similar buddy back in the day, and we would do the same thing. I mean, I remember a 16-year-old birthday was pay for the 11 a.m. and then end up walking through the 1:30 and the 4 before being picked up at 7:30. And so I had a long-range movie addiction as well. So I think that's why I've really been attracted to a lot of these great movie podcasts, and No Totally really sits up right there near the top in terms of some great shows.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me ask you this: one of the things that really attracted my listenership to you guys is, and tell me if I'm wrong here, because maybe it's just my impression, and I think I said this in my review, it really seems like you guys do a lot of research. Now, maybe not. I mean, like, you must be watching this several times, definitely a recent viewing, and like, is there notes involved? How do you guys go about it?
I think it kind of depends on a week by week basis, but I can tell you I think the most common thing for us, we definitely watch the movie like the night before, I think. I think we both tend to watch the movie on Friday nights, and we record the podcast on Saturday nights and then release it on Tuesday morning because I'm doing a lot of editing in between. But as far as notes are concerned, I think Brian sometimes has notes, but I don't think it's every episode. And I have notes, but they kind of range from 3 sentences to like 3 pages. And I personally, I don't do any research, like as far as kind of going online and checking stuff out. I know that Brian does, but he and I both have really pretty good memories. And so, especially with movies that he and I are really into, knowing that Eric Stoltz was a first choice for Marty McFly in Back to the Future. That's just something that's kind of floating around in a lot of people's heads, and we kind of pull that stuff out. So I think I would love to say that we do a ton of research, and of course we're very flattered that it sounds like we do. I feel like a kind of a jerk. I should just say we do a ton of research, and that's why we sound so good.
Well, no, and I think it should be taken complimentary, because I think to the layperson, if you will, I would consider myself, a casual movie fan, especially, comparing to some of the shows that I've recommended, that it almost encyclopedic type, knowledge or recall from previous movie watching is, I think, does come off as well researched, and it is a compliment, because I'm looking back at some of my notes from the episode here, and I talked about one of the episodes. I know you guys talked about how one role fit into an actor's career arc, and that was a note I made when I was listening, and that type of authoritative summary, if you will, or observation is what I really get from you guys, and I think it's excellent.
Well, thank you. Actually, let me definitely really appreciate that. I will tell you that that kind of thing, when we talk about character arcs, or I'm sorry, when we talk about the arc of an actor's career or a director's career, that stuff is pretty much all coming off the top of our heads. And what I will say, so as not to sound super pretentious, but this is true. One of the easiest ways to sound authoritative with that stuff is just to act really confident and sound very authoritative. So I'll say, Christian Bale's best performance ever was in The Prestige, and that's just not under discussion. And then move on, and that kind of, it kind of makes you sound like you know what you're talking about because you're so direct and forceful with it. So that's one of my many tricks to make it sound like I know what I'm doing.
So do you guys discuss things in advance? Do you kind of put together a game plan before? You talked about watching the movie on Friday and recording on Saturday, sort of before you guys hit record. Are you kind of like, this is where we want to go, this is what we want to talk about, or is it more free-flowing?
Well, that's a great question. I wish that we planned anything out in advance. Like, we literally don't do anything in advance besides watch the movie. And the reason I say I wish we would do that is because the editing process is really where the through line of the episode comes together. So if you were to listen to our podcast live or listen to our recording session live, you would be subjected to about 2.5 hours of Brian and I kind of spinning our wheels, trying to find interesting things, trying to agree, trying to connect, trying to disagree, trying to make fun of each other. And that recording session, like I said, it can be as long as 2.5 hours, maybe as short as like 80 minutes. That I end up cutting down to 30 to 40 minutes if possible. So you're really getting a very small fraction of what's actually been recorded. And that's how we make up for not doing any prep ahead of time.
And if you're listening to this right now, if you're not a podcaster yourself and you're a listener, let me tell you, the real effort to this is definitely on the editing. I've tried to cut back, tried to be as close to live to tape as I can, but I have oftentimes doubled and tripled the episode length in editing afterwards as well. So I can appreciate that.
Well, with most things, if you're making a movie, this is probably wrong, but I think it's close enough to be to give kind of an idea. I think if you're shooting a movie that you shoot 9,000 minutes to every minute that actually appears in the film, or 900 minutes or something like that. So with most media, TV, movies, that kind of thing, there's so much that is recorded that you're not seeing. So with our podcast episodes, I typically spend 6 to 9 hours over the course of a few days editing to get from, let's say, 2.5 hours down to 50 minutes. That's actually, even though it sounds like a lot, that's actually not that bad compared to other professional, quote unquote, professional forms of entertainment. And to me, I feel like if I expect people to take their time to listen to what we're doing, then I want to be as close to those professional entertainers as possible, as far as respecting people's time, if that makes sense.
It does, and it's and again, I think it comes through in the final product.
Thank you so much.
Segueing from the movie review portion that you guys have done in a vast majority of your episodes, I also know that you've done a couple that were interview based. How did those come about? Well,
one of them was with Jeff Todd, who runs the enormously popular Twitter account One Perfect Shot. And I actually kind of accidentally, I didn't mean to interview the guy behind One Perfect Shot per se. I just saw tweets about the autism movie called Seven on the Spectrum, which is a documentary series that Jeff Todd wants to do following the lives of 7 families who have autistic children and over the course of 7 years. So it's kind of like inspired by the Michael Apted BBC series the Up series, 7 Up, 14 Up, 21 Up, which if you haven't seen it or heard about it, it's pretty fantastic. But that really interested me, so I wanted to get more exposure for him for the Indiegogo campaign that was funding, and it kind of turned out that he was also in charge of One Perfect Shot. Now, the way that it came about, and the other interview we did was with a couple of actors that I met at Communicon, which is the convention for the TV show Community, which I'm a huge fan of. Really, I think there was never any intention to keep the podcast really narrow. I think that anything that listeners can find interesting, entertaining, or learn about pop culture from is within our wheelhouse. And actually, currently our tagline is the movie discussion podcast in some places, and in other places it's the pop culture and movie discussion podcast or something like that. I'm going to give you an exclusive, Dan, if you don't mind.
That would be great.
I've been working on a new tagline to kind of cover everything that we want to do because I also have a few more interviews coming up that actually don't even have anything to do with show business. Like, for example, I spoke to a fellow Twitter user who I'm a huge fan of, his tweets and his outlook on life. He's got a blog. His name is Austin, and he was diagnosed 17 years ago as being high functioning autistic, which formerly was known as Asperger's syndrome. And that's something that I find really interesting. Obviously the Seven on the Spectrum documentary kind of loops back into that as well. But I wanted to get a chance to ask Austin because he's so honest and he's such an advocate for autistic people. I wanted to ask him some really blunt questions that maybe people in polite conversation wouldn't ask. Things like how accurate was the Rain Man portrayal? What do you think of people who say that they're autistic as kind of a joke to say that they're socially awkward? Those kinds of things. Again, nothing to do with movies. Anyway, so here's the exclusive. The tagline that I have that I'm going to start implementing soon is a simultaneously affirmative and negative conversation about movies and other important things.
Hey, I like it.
Thank you. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but it also talks about why the show is called No Totally. It's got that, simultaneously affirmative and negative part in it, which is why we decided to name the show that way. I just really liked, you hear people say it sometimes when they're agreeing with you. They're like, yeah, no, totally. And I really just have always been kind of tickled by the fact that that's a weird, like, affirmative, negative, affirmative kind of construction. And I kind of feel like it sums up the relationship that Brian and I have.
There's a contradiction sandwich there.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm sorry. Did I answer your question? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I just wanted to point out the show that you were referencing. It was episode 29
yes.
released. You guys released on October 21st. If anyone would like to go back and check that out, the Jeff Todd interview.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you sort of answered a few more of my questions. I was sort of curious about kind of where you guys wanted to go moving forward and if there was an expansion on the horizon. It's funny that, a lot of the shows I've been listening to have done almost that. And, I've tried to do it even here on my show, even talking with you in this episode, and even my my top 10 episode that I brought in for the first time, clips from other shows. I'm trying to do a lot of the same things, sort of experimenting with other things, kind of expanding the reach and the breadth of the show itself. And so I was kind of curious if you guys were looking to accomplish a lot of the same type of things.
Yeah. Because I didn't have to go to work in the week between Christmas and New Year's, I kind of put out a call on Twitter and I was just like, anybody who wants to be interviewed or wants me to be on their show, just get in touch and we'll talk about something. I don't know what, we'll figure it out. And I got a lot of responses, and those episodes are all interview based and they all kind of tackle one specific thing that I think the guest is in a good position to talk about, just like the one I referenced with Austin that's coming up. That was a ton of fun. I mean, it's something that doesn't fit specifically into the context of a movie podcast, but it's just something that I find interesting. I mean, you said earlier that podcasting is kind of like a disease, which it totally is. I mean, I think that one of the reasons why there are so many of them is that people want to create just in general, right? I mean, everybody picks up a guitar at some point. Everybody picks up a paintbrush at some point. And the hard thing, the reason why people get really good at things is because either they push through the parts where they're bad and make it to the other side when they're actually good at something, or it's because they don't know enough in the beginning to know that what they're doing maybe isn't, genius stature. And so they continue doing it. And I think that with podcasting, obviously it's very easy to do. All you need is a mic and a computer, and most computers have mics built in, and everybody has a computer, so it's just a very easy thing to do. But I think for creative people, and I would count myself as one of those, people who just like creating things, people who like telling stories, people who like to shape the culture that's coming out of them or going into them, really, really find a good home in podcasting because you never have to stop creating. Like you won't ever get hemmed into anything because you get to decide what you're doing. You don't have a network head telling you, don't go in that direction, don't go with that story arc. We need to bring this new hot blonde and monkey into the show next season, figure that out. It's never that kind of situation. So podcasting feeds the disease of creative people. And I would really I just want to do what's interesting to me and package it in a way that hopefully is interesting and illuminating to other people. And that kind of makes me sound like a supervillain, I guess. But yeah.
No, I think I would totally back you on that position. I mean, and I think that's exactly why we see such an explosion in podcasting, especially from things like actors and stand-up comedians, and even with those who never, through some other vehicle or some other channel, were able to ascend to some type of, higher level recognition, or, through a movie or TV or playing in a stand-up club. Yeah. But rather, just because you weren't discovered, now there's almost an even playing field, if you will. Right. And, an iTunes search for Mark Maron or for, Adam Carolla is the same search that can bring up your show or mine.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's an amazingly empowering feeling for those who do want to put something out in the world, and also to have something that sort of stands the test of time. One thing that I've thought of as a new podcast, and you guys have been at it longer than I've been, is this concept of what 5 to 10 years from now, listening back to some of this will mean to sort of my friends or my kids or my family, or heck, even myself, listening back to me, 10 years down the road will be awesome.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And I think that's great. But that's actually a great segue, Shaun, to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about. One component that I know has been great for me, and I really want to hear about for you guys, how you and Brian have taken to this, is that listener engagement. I know you guys are very active on Twitter, and you have a phenomenal website. I know that in your About section you talk about getting it updated, but I think it looks great. I really do. Thanks. So what have you guys seen from the show? How has the listener engagement been for you guys?
It's kind of been interesting. I think that like you said, I'm on Twitter all the time. Brian actually is a much busier human being than I am. And I'm way more afflicted with this disease as we're talking about. So it's mostly, I don't think he's tweeted something in months, but so it's pretty much me. I am a blabbermouth, and I also love consuming culture. And I feel like the closest thing to just heaven for me is Twitter. I didn't start using Twitter until we started the podcast, or until we started releasing the podcast to the world, which was just a few months ago. But, being able to see all the stuff that people like and all the really interesting stuff that they retweet is just fascinating to me. But it's very weird because you get a lot of engagement on Twitter. I think because I share things that are interesting to me, and a lot of the people who are following have similar interests as I do, and so it's kind of a natural fit. But I gotta be honest, I think a lot of people who maybe follow the account don't even really listen to the podcast. So it's almost like a different thing. It's almost like a separate arm. Like I'm tweeting under the banner of the podcast, so it's almost like a branding exercise.
No, and I think what's interesting about that is if you look at the numbers, there is a disconnect I have found between Twitter followers and sort of how many people are listening. Yeah. And I think there's always a fraction and a percentage. So not everyone who's following you is listening, and not everyone who's listening is following.
Yeah, exactly.
And that ends up being something that it sometimes becomes difficult to reconcile. It kind of makes me wonder why the listeners aren't following and why the followers aren't listening sometimes. But obviously there's an overlap there. But in terms of just feedback, I mean, have you guys received, suggestions for movies? Are you guys inundated with, are you going to do this movie? Or are you going to do that movie? Or I know from my standpoint, and maybe it's because I live with 2 feet firmly planted in the podcasting community, I'm getting constant requests from people asking me to review and recommend their show.
Right.
I'm just wondering from your listenership, in any vehicle, do you kind of have a similar clamoring for movies or interviews?
Actually, not really. I think, and sometimes that hurts my feelings because I figure, like you said, it's getting inundated by requests kind of makes you feel like your opinion matters on something. So sometimes my feeling is hurt by the fact that I think we've only maybe been suggested a handful of movies. But on the other hand, the way that I feel about it more recently is that people not only like to listen to our opinions, but they also trust that we're going to select something that is interesting to them. So I'm kind of trying to look at it that way. But as far as feedback, I mean, recently, I think people have been definitely connecting the podcast and the Twitter account because people are tweeting us with really positive things to say about specific episodes. I think when you start off on Twitter and people are like, "Hey, I like your podcast," and then you never hear from them again, it's kind of like, I wonder if they just wanted to follow or something. Like there's all these Twitter politics. But when people are kind of giving actual examples from the episodes and you can really tell that they're listening, it's it's basically the greatest feeling in the world ever. Like someone who's got 0 Twitter followers and follows 10,000 people, I don't care. It's just great to hear from anyone who's listening. The interaction that we've had, I think, is phenomenal because people listen to an episode and then they tweet us or email us or post on the comment section of our website as if they're kind of continuing the conversation. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
We'll get done with an episode and say, "Hey, I hadn't seen Jaws until I was 30 something. And so it wasn't really magical for me like it was for everybody else." And those are my thoughts. And then, someone will immediately get on Twitter and be like, "Well, you suck because Jaws is awesome." And, they're clearly having a conversation with me, but it's my voice that was recorded months ago being, captured in this conversation now, present day on Twitter. And that's just really cool. I love these conversations. And, having an opinion is, I think, scary in a lot of ways because you put yourself out there for a lot of hate and a lot of trolling and whatever. But I think for me, it's been really nice because it's important to me to be really honest on these podcasts. If I like something, if I don't like something, not to tiptoe around it, but also not to just spew pure hate for no reason, bring some evidence behind things. But that really leads to the really interesting conversations. So if nothing else, the podcast has really introduced me to a lot of people who, have half a brain to kind of have these kinds of conversations that I like to have.
Well, I can tell you this. In my opinion. First of all, if you're listening to this and you want to get in a movie request, let Shaun and Brian know on their Twitter account. And I talked about in one of my previous episodes about giving feedback to the hosts and the show producers because, as you mentioned, it is huge. And I know before I started doing this, I had no idea the value of what shooting off a quick tweet or dropping a quick email or just shooting over, "Hey, love the show," what that would really mean to a host. And now I try to do it as much as I possibly can. And, I talked about that on one of my previous episodes. And I'll tell you this quick story as well, Shaun, because I think that this is sort of a parallel when you talk about how there were, some requests and then lately not as many. I've mentioned before in previous episodes that, my history and background and really my current other passion is being a mobile DJ and doing weddings. And so often I will make announcements that taking requests. And oftentimes there will be no requests because everybody there is having a great time with what I'm already doing.
Sure.
And so some of my best parties have been at the end of the night, I got none or one request because they just enjoyed what I was putting out there for them. And so I think it's a lot of the same vein of what you were describing in terms of, if what they're getting already without bugging you, quote unquote, is what makes them happy, then you're doing something right.
Yeah, definitely.
But you alluded to some of the negativity that is out there, and I wanted to touch on this one subject. I know you guys had mentioned it on a previous episode, and I was sort of really wanted to hear what your perspective was on truly negative feedback, if you will. There was what I considered a ridiculous iTunes review left for No Totally that sort of called you out to, and when I read it and I listened to the next episode, I have no idea what this person was talking about. So as far as I'm concerned, it's discredited for ridiculousness. But I'm just curious in general, when you guys receive that type of feedback, you know, how do you not let it sort of put a wet towel over things, and kind of how do you turn the other cheek, so to speak, and move forward?
Yeah. So you're going to get another exclusive here, because I was kind of planning on going into this in a future episode, but instead we'll just play the clip from the wonderful Podcast Digest. So let me just let's give the listeners an idea of how awesome this review was. It not only was it a negative review about the podcast, it was actually more a negative review of me as a human being. Like right. It didn't say I hate this podcast. It was, and here are reasons A, B, and C. It was more like Shaun is a terrible human being, and here are reasons A, B, and C. And you've read the review, so you can vouch that I'm not, I'm not overreacting to this.
You're not exaggerating, no.
So, and again, I'll be 100% honest. Well, actually, sorry. Let me preface it with this. I have mentioned it on the show a few times, for comedy more than anything. And I kind of go back and forth with that because you don't want to feed the trolls, right? That's right. Rule number one. But one of the reasons why I thought it might be interesting to talk about on a future episode is because it really changed the show. And I'll tell you why. A lot of stuff in that review, I think, had a lot of truth to it. And you know what? Let me step back there. You can tell I have 300,000 thoughts about this review, so it's hard for me to kind of figure out where I want to put my foothold in. So I'll just kind of take you through it. Go ahead. If you're a listener, I would encourage you to read. It might take you a few hours because it's a very long review, but I encourage you to go read it so that you have some context about what we're talking about. So I got this review. And you're at that early point. I think this was our third review, maybe. It was very, very early on. You're at that point where you're excitedly refreshing the iTunes reviews all the time to see if anyone new is listening to your podcast other than the two people that you know for a fact are listening. And to get hit with a review like that, where I think the first sentence is, "This podcast is total failure, 100% thanks to Shaun," or something like that. To get something that was so personal right off the bat and force myself to read through it was really, really disheartening. And it hurt a lot. Like for the first 48 hours, I couldn't sleep the first couple of nights. I just really felt like there was someone out there who really hated my guts. And one of the reasons why it cut so deep is because there were a few things in there that really rang true to me. And although they might have been exaggerated versions of how I am on the show, there was still a little bit of truth. I mean, he basically said I was kind of condescending and a snob and mean and all kinds of stuff. And I won't go into like specifically every point of the review, even though I could, obviously. I've read it like 50 times, as I think most people would in this circumstance. Well, I hope I'm not like revealing myself as mentally disturbed or something by going through this.
I don't think so.
But yeah, I think there was some truth to it. And so what's really funny is we had a backlog of episodes at that point. We had maybe 5 or 6 that hadn't been released yet. And so I was kind of releasing them, as I got done editing. And so the next episode that we recorded right after that review was not the next episode on the feed. I think the next episode on the feed after that review was like Zodiac or something like that. And the episode that came right after that review was our episode on Her, which has gone on to become our most popular episode and has gotten us kind of the most acclaim from people who really know movies. It's an episode that I'm really, really proud of, and I think we did a really good job on it. And really, the reason why that episode is so good is because of that 48 hours of pain and then the following few days of sorting out, okay, he's right about this, but he's wrong about this, and he's right about this other thing, but he's really wrong about this other thing. I don't actually eat the heads of babies and whatever. And yeah, so at the end of the day, if anybody ever gets a review as vicious as this one, which I, sincerely hope that the small podcasters out there will never ever have to deal with that because it was really tough and really personal. But it's literally the best thing that ever happened to our podcast. And I'm not one of those guys who lets criticism roll off my back very easily. I'm actually very easily bothered by that kind of thing. So I think I think as far as like a source, you can trust me on this, that it will only hurt for a small while and you should not think about giving up. And it is the easiest thing in the world to take that and make yourself better from it. And if you ever doubt yourself, just listen to the episode, listen to our first episode on Inception, and then listen to our episode on Her, and listen to the differences, and realize that you're gonna come out better.
Well, I think that's about the best possible way you ever could have handled something like that.
Thank you.
Quite frankly, I don't know that I necessarily would have handled it the same way. It reminds me of a ton of different thoughts. You know, I'm a parent and, you know, a step parent. I started when the kids were pretty young and now they're teenagers. And once they hit teenagers, words like I hate you have started to come out. And I used to tell my wife all the time, who would get upset at things like that. I say, well, you know, I don't really believe you're a real parent until a kid tells you they hate you. You know, and sort of in the same vein here, that I don't know if I heard on one podcast, and I listened to so many, I really couldn't tell you which one, that you haven't really arrived unless you've really gotten that 1-star thrashing negative review. I think it's sort of a badge of honor to wear with pride at this point. But it really makes me ask this question. You know, I made a decision with the Podcast Digest before I recorded the very first episode, and I remember making a conscious decision on, was I going to just, you know, randomly listen to things and either trash or upvote, so to speak, you know, recommend or trash podcasts. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, who am I to be able to take what is real work and, you know, real time and real effort and say it's garbage?
Right.
It makes me think, you know, you described earlier, Shaun, the time and the effort and the work and the commitment that you guys put out there. You guys don't have ads. I'm assuming there is no revenue source here.
None whatsoever.
But yet you describe, you know, the hours and hours and hours that you've put into this. And look, I'm not trying to take apart a review system. I'm glad it's there. But look, if you don't like the show, unsubscribe. Dear listener, if you don't like a show, unsubscribe. If it's not for you, that's okay. Last time I heard, podcasts are approaching 300,000 different shows in iTunes at this point. There's one that you will like. You know, I don't see the reason this person had to take the time, whether they legitimately believed it or not. What's the point? Yeah. You know, that's sort of my perspective on it. And it's like, look, if you don't like something, DM them on Twitter or shoot them a quick email or say, you know. Right. But that's, as you know, as far as I know, there's no way that ever goes anywhere.
Right.
And that's there in perpetuity. And that's terrifically sad because of one nut job.
Yeah.
I'll say it. You know.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
It's hard for me because, like I said, I do think it is the best thing that ever happened to the show. And I feel like if it hadn't happened, I would still be waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because like I said earlier, being honest is really, really important to me for the show. And I think that's one of the things that people connect to, I hope. Just like in real life, there are going to be people who can't deal with me on basis of who I am. And that's totally fine with me. It's almost like the waiting would be the hardest part, right? Just knowing that I might cross a line or be a dick or something at some point, and just waiting for someone to finally come down and put me in my place. You know, I feel really lucky that we had it happen early on at a time where we weren't really as good as we could have been. And I hadn't thought as much about what kinds of opinions and what kinds of things I should be saying. So, yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with your sentiment, Dan. I think it's beautiful, and I would never take that away from you. But for me, I honestly, this sounds so fake, but I honestly am super, super grateful for that review.
Well, and it opens some doors too because now there's no fear, right?
Oh,
If somebody
absolutely.
says something to you on Twitter or leaves another iTunes review, I don't know that it will ever be worse, I
Uh-huh.
mean, and so if somebody does a 3 star or somebody sends you a mention on Twitter that's not so hot, it will never be
Yeah.
as bad as that one as far as I'm concerned.
That's
So,
exactly right. Yeah.
bring on the honest feedback now because I think you're good to go.
Yeah. That's yes. I spent 15 minutes trying to put that into words, and you did it in a sentence. That's exactly what I'm trying to say.
Well, I want to talk about those reviews. The reviews that has been, and I don't know if this was post that or if that experience sort of tied into this, but you've started something on Fridays, and if you're not following at No Totally on Twitter, you should be, for one, and especially keep an eye open on Fridays because you've
Yeah.
started this hashtag FRRF. What in the world is that?
So you are familiar with Follow Friday, yes?
Yes.
So that's a normal thing on Twitter where you just
Mm-hmm.
follow people on Friday. And I like that. Like I said, I only started using Twitter recently. So I was kind of going through my first week on Twitter going, what's this FF crap? I found out that it was Follow Friday and I was like, hey, that's awesome. So I started just tweeting a bunch of at names all the time. And it felt fun until I went back on our timeline and I realized, hey, I just blasted all these accounts, and what's the chance that someone's going to actually follow these, or some of these are more important to me than others, and some of these are real people and some of them are companies. How do I kind of distinguish? So I started being a lot more selective with who I sent out on Follow Fridays. And actually the Q Filmcast, their account kind of inspired me in the sense that they don't tweet lists out. They tweet one account per tweet, and they really kind of put in a little blurb about why you should actually follow that account. So I started doing that, and it was like, hey, this is a great idea, and I've got a lot to say about these accounts. They're actually very important to me, and it's not just a big list of things. So I started doing that with the blurbs, and then I was like, wait a minute, I'm FFing only podcasts, and following their Twitter account is great, but I was looking at the In Session Film podcast iTunes page, and they've got so on Twitter they've got like over 1,000 followers, which is really good for a small indie podcast like that one and ours. And I noticed on their iTunes page they only had like 20 something reviews or ratings actually. And ratings are so much easier than reviews. All you got to do is click something. So like you were talking about earlier, there's this discordance between, followers and listeners and all that kind of thing. There was this huge discrepancy to me between Twitter followers and ratings. And so I figured, why not, since I'm already encouraging people to follow these other podcasts, why not at the same time encourage them to rate and review the same podcast? So FRRF stands for Follow, Rate, Review Friday. And what I do is kind of say, well, if you listen to any podcasts at all, you know that rating and reviewing on iTunes is probably one of the single most important things you could do for that podcast. Everybody, you say it on your show, I say it on my show, everybody says it on their shows to rate and review us in iTunes. And I wanted to kind of, I guess when I would look at iTunes pages like ours and I saw, 3 ratings and reviews, I I could definitely relate to people going to that page and seeing how empty it is and being like, eh, it's a really small podcast and I came here to rate and review it, but like there's no ratings and reviews up here and it's not a big deal. So why do this? Whatever. And then close it up. So I thought, well, if we get more ratings and reviews on pages, that will attract more ratings and reviews and make it less weird for people to write stuff. And so to kind of put our money where our mouth is, I started rating and reviewing the shows that I tagged every Friday and then posting a little screenshot of the review that I gave. And one thing that's been really cool about it, obviously, that gives the podcast in question a rating and a review, but it's also really cool because just like with a lot of relationships, these Twitter relationships, you respect other podcasts and you look up to them, and there are things that you think are really great about them, but it's hard to fit these kinds of really touchy-feely compliments into just a conversation, like there's never really a place for that. But it's cool that on Fridays now I get to talk about these podcasts that I really respect and write them just like really flowery, over not over the top, but really what's the adjective I'm looking for?
Oh boy, let's see. Complimentary is a good
Sure,
one.
yeah.
Because I think it would sort of defeat the spirit if it wasn't
Yeah,
complimentary. I would think that would be going the wrong direction. But
definitely. Yeah, I just try to be as emotional as possible, and like I try to cut to the heart of what it is specifically that I like about the podcast that I'm writing
I got your
about.
word. I've got your word. Valuable.
There we go.
That's what it
Thank
is.
you.
It's valuable because when you put that out there, not only is it valuable to the show that you've written the review for, but I think it's also a valuable example and a reminder because, if you're anything like, my account, there's a lot of podcasts that end up following other podcasts
Yeah.
just as support because more often than not, if you are a podcaster, you also like listening to podcasts. And so you follow other show accounts and it sort of sets a very good example. And so that's the word I'll use. I'll use value.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's something that I don't know. I think that, like you said, we're all, it seems like every other follower that you get on Twitter when you're a podcaster is another podcaster. And I think all of us want to break out of that, but at the
Right.
same time, love the community so dearly, right? So it's not even a love-hate relationship. It's a love-love relationship. And this is one way to, I think, utilize that community to help each other.
I agree. I think it's great. And that the hashtag FF deal, the Follow Friday situation. I'm sort of like you. I've been on Twitter since like 2007, but the show account I created just this past summer, and immediately started to follow other shows as I was building up a library on what I wanted to recommend.
Yeah.
But so when other podcasts put those out there, that is a huge way for me to find other great shows, and I guess I'm a listener to the highest exponent because I'm looking to find great shows to listen to, but then ones I could possibly convert and want to recommend. And so with what you guys are doing, I don't know how many times I've at minimum at least followed the account and then kind of taken a look from there. And so
great.
I know that if you guys are putting in the time to be able to go that far to recommend something, then I think it's worth my time to investigate it further and download and take a listen. And that's why I think that's a very valuable thing.
Well, I appreciate it. It's the funny thing I just realized it's like it's the poor man's version of the Podcast Digest, really.
Sort of. Well, I'm going to give you an opportunity here, Shaun. We talked about this beforehand to take your mini podcast digesting skills to the next level. And I asked you to come prepared here with this episode with a show for you to recommend that I would be able to share with the Podcast Digest audience. So what do you want to recommend?
The show. Okay, if anybody follows us on Twitter, this will be no surprise to you. The show that I would like to recommend is the Video Negative Podcast, which they take a bad movie from, I think, the 90s. I think they are specifically limiting it to the decade of the 90s, and they just kind of unleash on it and just make brutal fun of the movie. And the reason I love this show is because, well, first of all, the three guys on the show, they're hilarious, and at the same time, they're very smart. They have great, literature and film technical backgrounds, and they're just so quick and funny. They are basically one of the reasons, along with that bad review that we got, they're one of the reasons why I'm kind of moving from just sitting there and making fun of stuff to moving to kind of examining the technical side of film, because in my opinion, they have that side of it completely covered. Like the world doesn't need me doing that at a lower level than they do. So I'm just moving on to a different area of review.
And that's cool, and I'm glad that you mentioned that because it's one I've not yet checked out, and that's exactly what I try to do here on the Podcast Digest is bring shows to the attention that people have not subscribed to yet. So I know now it's on my list for things, and folks, check the show notes or the podcastdigest.info, and I will have their website, which is videonegativepodcast.blogspot.com, as well as the links to the Twitter accounts for those three hosts that Shaun had mentioned.
Yeah, and if you have if there are any Anglophiles out there, they broadcast out of the UK, and their accents are very sexy.
The accents are very important. They're very important. There's something about that English accent, I think we can all agree, is great to listen to.
Yeah, it just melts my heart.
That's for sure.
They're fantastic.
Well, Shaun, before we go tonight, I know we've covered a lot of ground and we've talked about a lot of things, but I want to give you one more chance. Tell the audience, tell the listener anything. Tell them where to find No Totally. Tell them where to find you. Anything you like.
Sure. Basically, we have all the stuff. We have like the Facebook and the Google and all that stuff, but just follow us on Twitter @NoTotally because that'll give me the opportunity to bother you about the other stuff. And I don't want to make you have to remember too many things. So @NoTotally, follow us on Twitter. That I'll just retake the whole thing.
There you
go. Let's see. I'll start from when you asked the question of what else I wanted to say.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, we have everything. We have like the Facebook and the Google and all that stuff, but really just because I don't want to cram too much information into your heads, just follow us on Twitter @NoTotally, and eventually I'll tweet, the other links and stuff to you if you want to follow us on those other things as well. Also listen to episode 12 of the Podcast Digest, I guess. As far as the last word that I would like to have on the show, and I did not warn you about this, Dan, but one of my ulterior motives for coming on the show, especially today, is because I found out today that even though we were not included in your top 10 episodes of 2014, you actually have heard our episode on her. Now, this is important because I was under the impression that we didn't make your top 10 because you hadn't heard our best episodes. But I found out that you have heard probably our best episode and did not include it. So I would like for you on your show that you were kind enough to invite me to, I would like to corner you and ask why.
Her is a great episode. If you are just finding No Totally here today by listening to this, you do need to go back and listen to her. However, I will say that her was actually not out yet at the time I reviewed the show.
Really? Oh, that's right. That's right. Episode 12, right.
And actually, in my notes back from the first time I reviewed you guys, the one actually, and her was great. One of the things I like, it's twofold. I love listening to No Totally when I've seen the movie, and especially if I haven't seen the movie, because it really kind of makes me want to go out and check it out. But one of the episodes that I was really took a liking to was when you guys talked about adaptation.
Oh, cool.
That was one of my favorite episodes. I will go this far and say her was excellent, but I also feel adaptation was an excellent episode as well. Not only because I think the movie's great, but I think the discussion you guys had was great, and I also think that movie didn't get near enough attention, where, of course, her was a blockbuster. Sure. Adaptation, I think, is probably a little less viewed, especially recently, and folks should go back and watch that as well. So that'll be my non-answer answer to the exclusion from the top 10 list.
That was the best. You like, it's like I'm a baby and you shook some keys in front of me, because I completely forgot my question. I was just going to start going on and on about how adaptation is like one of my top 3 favorite movies, and how you're a brilliant genius for liking that episode. And that was very well done. I'm jealous of your Jedi skills there.
Well, I'll tell you, the top 10 list was very hard to do. I actually was going to do a top 5 of our friends over at Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks, but couldn't even remotely limit it to 5. So I thought when I did 10 that I'd be okay, and even so, the episode went longer than I typically do. But but I knew that, with 30 plus shows out there, I was going to have to exclude a lot. And I was trying to do my best not to duplicate more than one episode from some of the shows because, all of the shows I've recommended, I'm still subscribed to all of them, love them all, but there was just no way to fit them all. And about the only rule I gave myself was the newsy type shows I did exclude off the bat. So, some of my favorite shows I listen to, like Daily Tech News Show or these weekly kind of newsy shows, I just didn't include them. Yeah, hang up and listen because it was just it wasn't necessarily what I wanted to go for in my top 10, but it was my first try. There'll be more.
It's two things. One, I applaud your thick skin. I'm trying to give you a taste of that negative review that I got, so you can kind of feel the power coming from it. But also, I can't argue with any of the 10 episodes that you had. I thought it was a great list. I went and re-listened to the How Is This Movie episode that you recommended as a result of listening to your episode. So obviously, we're going to try very hard to be on your list next year. I don't know what the eligibility is, but that's going to give us something to shoot for. But honestly, I have no qualms with your list. I think it was a great list. I couldn't agree more. And even though we were not, a huge very top echelon of the Dan Lizette Podcast Digest experience, I'm honored that we were invited on anyway.
Well, Shaun, you guys do have this honor. This has been my longest episode of the Podcast Digest so far. So you will hold that crown up high with pride.
I feel so terrible now. I was just about to offer to edit this episode for you, but then it wouldn't come out till 2016, and that would probably be an issue.
Well, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to join me here, Shaun, and I hope that I look forward to what you guys are going to do in the future. I think you've told us about some really exciting stuff, going off into some new areas, and I, for one, am really excited to see where No Totally goes from here. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, sir. And may I say, you're an excellent interviewer.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And folks, I thank you for listening. I thank you for following on Twitter at Pod Digest. If you would like to hear episode 12, where I feature No Totally or any of those previous episodes, go check out thepodcastdigest.com. Easiest place to find all those back episodes. You can also do the whole liking on Facebook thing. Just search for the Podcast Digest. And as we talked about at length, a rating on iTunes or Stitcher would be wonderfully appreciated. And if you don't like it, just unsubscribe. Honestly. Thank you guys very much for listening to the Podcast Digest. I'll be back next week with more Podcast Digest. Have a good night.
Thanks for watching.